People often ask me one simple question. What is the luckiest thing that ever happened to you? Some people smile and talk about winning money. Others talk about meeting the love of their life or getting their dream job. My answer is always different. The luckiest thing that ever happened to me was missing a bus. People usually laugh. What? That's your lucky story? I smile every time, but I never laugh with them, because I know what happened next. Even now, 3 years later, I can still remember that morning, as if it were yesterday. It was a cold Tuesday in early March. The sky was grey, and the streets were already full of people. Everyone looked busy. Everyone seemed to be running somewhere. I was one of them. I left my apartment a little later than usual. I had stayed up too late the night before to finish a report. My eyes felt heavy, and I was already worried about work. That morning was important. Our company had a meeting with a new client. My manager had reminded us about it all week. "Please don't be late," he said again and again. "I won't," I promised. But life does not always follow our plans. As I walked toward the bus stop, I checked the time on my phone. 8:12. Only 3 more minutes. If I walk faster, I'll make it, I whispered to myself. I crossed the small park near my apartment and hurried down the sidewalk. Then I noticed an elderly woman standing beside a bench. A paper bag had broken. Bright oranges rolled across the ground. One orange even rolled into the street. "Oh, no," she said softly as she bent down. People walked past her without stopping. For 1 second, I kept walking too. I was already late. If I stopped, I might miss my bus. Then I looked back. She was still trying to pick up the fruit by herself. I let out a quiet sigh. "It's only a minute," I told myself. I walked back. "Let me help you," I said. Her face became bright at once. "Oh, thank you, dear." Together, we picked up the oranges one by one. I even ran into the street to grab the last one before a car reached it. She smiled and carefully placed every orange into another shopping bag. "You saved my breakfast," she said with a gentle laugh. I laughed too. It was nothing. Before I left, she touched my arm lightly. "I hope something good happens to you today." Her words stayed with me as I started running again. I looked at my watch, 8:16. My heart sank. No. I could already see the bus stop at the end of the street. The bus was there. The doors were closing. "Wait!" I shouted as I ran as fast as I could. The driver looked in my direction for just a second. Then the doors closed. The bus pulled away. I stopped running. My hands rested on my knees as I tried to catch my breath. I watched the bus disappear around the corner. For a long moment, I said nothing. Then I kicked a tiny stone across the sidewalk. "Seriously," I muttered. "Why today?" I felt angry. I felt frustrated. 1 minute. Just 1 minute. That was all it took. I pulled out my phone to call a taxi. Before I could tap the screen, it started ringing. It was Emma, my co-worker. I smiled with relief. Maybe the meeting had been delayed. I answered the call. "Emma, I'm so sorry I missed the bus. I'll be there as soon as I—" She interrupted me. Her voice was shaking. "Don't come." I frowned. "What do you mean?" There was a long silence. Then she whispered, "The bus you always take." My heart suddenly stopped beating for a moment. "The bus you always take." Emma's voice was so quiet that I could hardly hear her. "It had an accident." For a few seconds I could not understand her words. "What?" "The bus crashed at the Maple Street crossing," she said. "Please don't go there." Everything around me suddenly became silent. Cars were still moving. People were still walking. Someone nearby was talking on the phone. But all I could hear was my own heartbeat. "No," I whispered. "That can't be right." Emma took a deep breath. "I saw it on the news. Some people are badly hurt. The police have closed the road." My hands started to shake. The phone almost slipped from my fingers. I looked in the direction where the bus had disappeared only a few minutes earlier. It was gone. I thanked Emma without really thinking and ended the call. For a moment, I simply stood there. I could not move. I could not even think. Then I started walking toward the crossing. Not because I wanted to, because my feet seemed to move on their own. The closer I got, the more people I saw. Police cars, ambulances, fire trucks. Yellow safety tape blocked the road. A crowd stood behind it. No one was speaking loudly. Everyone looked shocked. I stopped at the edge of the crowd. The bus was there. Its front window was broken. One side was badly damaged. Pieces of glass covered the road like tiny pieces of ice. Emergency workers hurried from one person to another. I saw people sitting on the sidewalk with blankets over their shoulders. Some were crying. Some stared into space without saying a word. I felt cold, even though I was wearing a thick coat. Every morning I sat near the middle of that bus, the left side, next to the window. I looked at that part of the bus. The window was completely gone. I could not stop thinking. That is my seat. I sit there every day. A terrible picture filled my mind. If I had caught the bus, if I had not stopped to help the old woman, I would have been sitting there. My legs suddenly felt weak. I sat down on a nearby bench and covered my face with both hands. I had never been so close to losing my life. Not because I made a smart decision. Not because I planned carefully. Just because I was 1 minute late. 1 minute. That was all. A police officer walked over to the people nearby. "If you have family members on the bus, please stay calm. We are checking everyone's condition." His voice sounded steady, but his eyes looked tired. I slowly stood up. There was nothing I could do. I was only someone who almost got on that bus. As I walked away, my phone rang again. This time it was my mother. "Are you at work?" she asked. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. She became worried. "Are you okay?" I looked back one last time. The broken bus stood quietly in the middle of the road. I said softly, "I'm okay." There was a long silence. Then I heard my mother take a deep breath. Thank goodness. When I got home that evening, she was already waiting for me. The moment she opened the door, she hugged me tightly, much tighter than usual. Neither of us spoke. We did not need to. After a while, she looked at me with wet eyes and gently touched my face. "I'm just happy you're home." Those simple words broke something inside me. I hugged her again. For the first time that day, I cried. Not because I was hurt. Not because I was afraid. I cried because I suddenly understood something. Life can change in less than a minute. That night, I could not sleep. I kept hearing the old woman's voice. "I hope something good happens to you today." At that time, I thought her words had come true. I believed I had already used up all my luck. But I had no idea. The biggest change in my life had not even begun. After the bus accident, life slowly returned to normal. At least, that was what everyone said. People went back to work. The traffic moved again. The broken bus was gone. The news stopped talking about the accident after a few days. But I was not the same. Every morning, when I stood at the bus stop, I felt nervous. If a bus arrived too fast, my heart raced. If I heard loud brakes, I turned my head without thinking. Sometimes I woke up in the middle of the night. I would ask myself the same question. Why did I miss that bus? I never found an answer. Still, I tried to move forward. I worked hard. I stayed late at the office. I smiled more often because I felt grateful just to be alive. I told myself that life had given me a second chance. I should not waste it. Then, 4 months later, another surprise came. This time, it did not feel lucky. One Monday morning, everyone received an email from the Human Resources Department. The subject line was simple: Company meeting, 10 a.m. The office felt strangely quiet. People looked at one another but said nothing. Some already guessed what was coming. At 10 o'clock, we gathered in the meeting room. Our CEO stood at the front. He looked tired, much older than I remembered. He took a slow breath before speaking. "I won't hide the truth," he said. "Our company has lost several important clients." The room became completely silent. "We have tried many ways to solve the problem." He lowered his head for a moment. "But today we have to make a very difficult decision." I felt my stomach tighten. "We need to reduce the number of employees." No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound came from the air conditioner above us. Later that afternoon, names began to appear one by one. People walked into small meeting rooms. Some came out with red eyes. Some quietly packed their desks. Others hugged their co-workers before leaving. I kept telling myself, maybe my name won't be called. I had worked hard. I had never missed a deadline. I believed I had done enough. Then my phone rang. It was a message from Human Resources. "Please come to meeting room 3. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Deep inside, I already knew. 15 minutes later, I walked back to my desk carrying a small cardboard box. Inside were a coffee mug, 2 notebooks, a family photo, and a tiny green plant that I had almost forgotten to water. That little box suddenly felt much heavier than it looked. As I left the building, I turned around one last time. For 5 years, that office had been part of my life. Now it belonged to someone else. The next few weeks were harder than I expected. Every morning I opened my laptop and searched for jobs. I changed my resume again and again. I wrote careful cover letters. I practiced interview questions in front of the mirror. I am a hard-working person. I learn quickly. I enjoy working with a team. I repeated those sentences until they no longer sounded real. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Some companies never replied. Some sent short emails. "Thank you for your interest. We have chosen another candidate." Each message looked almost the same. After a while, I stopped opening them right away. I already knew what they would say. One rainy afternoon, I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair. The apartment felt unusually quiet. I looked out the window as people hurried home with their umbrellas. I whispered to myself, maybe I wasn't lucky after all. Yes, I had survived the accident. But what kind of life was I living now? No job, no direction, no confidence. I wondered if fate had simply delayed my bad luck instead of taking it away. That evening my phone buzzed. It was a message from my old college friend, Daniel. "I'm at a coffee shop near the river. Come join me. You look like you need a break." I stared at the message. I almost typed, "Maybe another time." Instead, after a long pause, I put on my coat. I had no idea that one small decision would change my life for the second time. The rain had almost stopped by the time I reached the coffee shop. Small drops still fell from the grey sky, making tiny circles on the river outside the window. Daniel was already there. He waved when he saw me. "You finally came," he said with a smile. I almost didn't. I admitted as I sat down. I know. He pushed a warm cup of coffee toward me. That's exactly why I asked you. For the next hour, we talked about everything except work. We remembered funny moments from college. We laughed about terrible cooking experiments. I forgot about job applications and rejection emails. As we were talking, someone walked over to our table. Daniel? Daniel looked up and smiled. Michael, it's been a long time. The two men shook hands like old friends. Then Daniel turned to me. This is my college classmate, Michael. Michael smiled and offered his hand. Nice to meet you. There was something calm about him. He did not wear an expensive suit. He did not try to impress anyone. He simply looked like someone who enjoyed listening. Daniel pointed at me. We're talking about job hunting. Michael looked at me with kind eyes. Really? What kind of work are you looking for? I told him about my previous job. I also admitted that I had been unemployed for almost 3 months. To my surprise, he did not give me advice right away. Instead, he asked questions. What did you enjoy most about your last job? What made you feel proud? If money were not the biggest problem, what kind of work would you choose? No interviewer had ever asked me those questions. I thought carefully before answering. I like solving problems. I enjoy helping people. And I like working with a team that trusts each other. Michael nodded slowly. I think our company is looking for someone like you. I blinked. Really? He smiled. We're still a small company. The salary isn't amazing, but we care about people. He reached into his bag and handed me a simple business card. If you're interested, send me your resume. I looked at the card for several seconds. It felt almost unreal. After months of hearing no, someone had just opened a door without me even asking. I will, I said, and thank you. He stood up to leave. Before walking away, he smiled once more. Sometimes the best conversations happen by accident. After he left, I turned to Daniel. Did you plan this? Daniel laughed. I didn't even know he would be here. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel said quietly, Life is funny, isn't it? I looked out the window. The rain had stopped. Soft evening sunlight broke through the clouds. A week later, I walked into Michael's office for an interview. The room was simple. There were no long tables, no serious faces. No one tried to make me nervous. Instead, people asked about my ideas. They asked how I worked with others. They wanted to know what I had learned from difficult times. When I mentioned the bus accident, the room became quiet. Michael looked at me and asked gently, What did that experience teach you? I smiled. That tomorrow is never promised. So if I have a chance to do meaningful work today, I don't want to waste it. He smiled back. I was hoping you would say something like that. 2 days later, I received the call. We'd love to have you on our team. I accepted before he could finish the sentence. The new job paid a little less than my old one. The office was smaller. The company was younger. But something felt different from the very beginning. People knew each other's names. We ate lunch together. When someone made a mistake, we looked for solutions instead of someone to blame. Work did not feel like something I had to survive. It felt like a place where I belonged. A few weeks after I joined the company, a new employee started on our team. She walked into the office carrying a box of notebooks and smiled nervously. When our manager introduced us, she looked at me and said, I hope we can work well together. I smiled and held out my hand. I'm sure we will. At that moment, I thought I was simply meeting a new co-worker. I had no idea. I was about to meet the person who would change the rest of my life. Her name was Lily. She was kind, patient, and always ready to help others. On her first day, she got lost while looking for the meeting room. I laughed and said, "Don't worry, I got lost on my first day too." She smiled. "Really? At least now I'm not the only one." From that moment, talking to her felt easy. We worked on the same projects. We ate lunch together with the team. Sometimes we stayed late to finish a report, then walked to the train station together. She loved small things that many people never noticed. The smell of fresh coffee in the morning, the colors of the sky before sunset, the quiet sound of rain on the office windows. Little by little, she taught me to slow down. One evening after work, we stopped at a small park near the office. Children were playing. An old couple was feeding birds. The whole place felt peaceful. Lily looked at me and asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why do you always help strangers?" I smiled. I wasn't always like this. Then I told her about the old woman. The broken paper bag, the oranges rolling across the street, the bus I missed, the accident. She listened without saying a word. When I finished, she looked at me with gentle eyes. "You know," she said softly, "maybe you didn't just save her day." "What do you mean?" "Maybe she saved your life too." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The evening wind moved the leaves above our heads. I thought about that morning again. If I had ignored the old woman, if I had kept running, everything after that moment would have disappeared. No second chance, no new company, no peaceful evenings like this, and no Lily. A year later, I asked her to marry me. She smiled before I could even finish my question. "Yes," she said, 1,000 times, yes. Our wedding was small. Only our families and close friends came. My mother cried almost the whole day. Daniel gave a short speech that made everyone laugh. Michael stood beside me like an older brother. As I looked around the room, one thought stayed in my heart. None of these people would be standing here if I had caught that bus. Several years have passed since then. Life is still not perfect. We have busy days. We argue sometimes. We worry about money. We get tired. But every evening when I open the front door, Lily smiles and says, "Welcome home." Those two simple words remind me how lucky I really am. Last month, our little daughter started asking questions about everything. One night, while we were reading together, she looked up at me. "Daddy?" "Yes." "What's the luckiest thing that ever happened to you?" I smiled. "The luckiest thing?" She nodded. I looked at Lily, who was smiling from the kitchen. Then I looked back at my daughter. "I missed a bus." She frowned. "That's lucky." It didn't feel lucky that day. "So, why?" I picked her up and sat her on my lap. "Because sometimes life takes something away," I said, "so it can give you something even better." She thought about my words for a moment. Then she asked the question that made me smile. "So, if you caught the bus..." I kissed the top of her head. "I would never have met your mommy." She looked across the room and laughed. "I'm happy you missed it too." That night, after she fell asleep, I stood by the living room window. Outside, a city bus quietly drove past our apartment. For a second, I watched it disappear into the darkness. Years ago, I would have chased that bus with all my strength. Tonight, I simply smiled. Some people spend their whole lives regretting the things they missed. I used to think the same way. Now I know better. Sometimes the door that closes is the one that saves you. Sometimes the road you never planned to take becomes the one that leads you home. And sometimes The luckiest moment of your life is the one you almost called bad luck.